I was grieving our stillborn child while my husband was celebrating his newborn son with another woman. What he didn't realize was that I had already taken steps to turn his world upside down. Jonathan believed money could fix everything. That no matter what he did, his wealth would protect him. He thought he could replace me the same way he replaced our child. With something newer, something better. But money can disappear overnight. And so can the life he built on my suffering. I was going to make sure of that. Before we begin, I want to thank each of you for being part of this journey. If you enjoy gripping stories of justice, betrayal, and redemption, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us bring more powerful narratives to life. Now, let's dive into this tale of revenge, where karma finally catches up. I sat in the cold, sterile hospital room, staring at the blank wall in front of me. The rhythmic beeping of machines had long since faded into white noise. My fingers curled around the edges of the hospital blanket, numb and unmoving. Somewhere in the distance I could hear a newborn crying. Someone else's child. Not mine. Mine had never even taken a breath. I had imagined this moment differently. I had pictured Jonathan at my side, his hand wrapped tightly around mine, whispering that everything would be okay. That even if life had been cruel, we would face it together. But he wasn't here. He had never been here. And I knew exactly where he was. I reached for my phone with stiff fingers, unlocking it with a slow, deliberate movement. The screen lit up instantly, the last message from Jonathan staring back at me like a slap across the face. He's here. Our son is born. 7 pounds, healthy and strong. Sophia did amazing. I'll call you soon. A sharp, twisted laugh crawled up my throat, but it never escaped. Instead, my chest ached with the weight of it, pressing down until I thought I would suffocate. My hands shook, but not from grief. Not anymore. I had spent the last 9 months thinking I was sharing a life with him, when in reality he had already started another. I had lost our child alone while he had been cradling a newborn in his arms, celebrating a future he had never planned to include me in. Jonathan hadn't just betrayed me. He had erased me. I turned the phone over in my hands, staring at the blank, soulless surface. For the first time in days, my mind felt sharp. The pain was still there, a deep and ugly wound, but beneath it was something else. Something steady. Something cold. Grief had broken me. But betrayal had rebuilt me into something unrecognizable. I stood up from the hospital bed, my body still weak, still aching. But I wasn't going to cry. Not anymore. I walked to the small bag I had packed for what should have been the happiest moment of my life. The baby blanket I had so carefully chosen sat on top, untouched. I ran my fingers over the soft fabric before slowly folding it, tucking it back into the bag. I had been preparing for motherhood. Now I was preparing for something else entirely. My mind replayed every moment, every lie, every carefully crafted deception Jonathan had fed me over the years. I had been a fool to believe him. A fool to think that love, vows, and shared memories meant anything to a man like him. But he was a fool too, because he thought I would simply fade away. I grabbed my coat, ignoring the dull ache in my body as I walked out of the hospital room, one step after another. Each movement felt deliberate, a quiet promise to myself. I wasn't leaving this place empty-handed. I was taking something with me. Vengeance. Jonathan had built his life on lies. Now I was going to tear it apart. The scene of his happiness. I found them without effort. Jonathan wasn't the kind of man to hide. He thrived in the spotlight, in grand gestures and social validation. If there was a moment worth celebrating, it would be public, extravagant, undeniable. And I was right. The restaurant was as pretentious as I expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive wines displayed like trophies, soft jazz floating through the air. It was the kind of place Jonathan used to take me to, back when I was the woman in his life. I stepped inside, my presence unnoticed at first. The hostess barely glanced at me, already scanning the room for more important guests. I followed her gaze and found them instantly. Jonathan sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by friends, business partners, and family. He was smiling, holding a glass of champagne in one hand, his other resting gently on her back. Sophia. She was glowing, basking in the attention, her eyes flickering toward the bassinet beside her. Inside, a newborn slept peacefully, oblivious to the world he had been born into. Jonathan leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. He looked at her the way he used to look at me, as if she were his world. For a moment, something dark twisted inside me. Not jealousy. Not pain. Just cold, simmering rage. They were celebrating. Raising their glasses, toasting to their future. My fingers curled into fists. My nails dug into my palms. But I didn't move. Not yet. This wasn't the moment. Not here. Not like this. If I confronted him now, it would be messy. Emotional. Weak. And I refused to be weak ever again. So instead I turned away, walking out just as unnoticed as I had entered. There would be a time for confrontation. But it would be on my terms. The first step toward destruction. By the time I got home, my mind was already working. Jonathan believed in power. In control. In the illusion of untouchability. I would take that away from him. Piece by piece. I grabbed my laptop, opening folders I had ignored for months. Jonathan's financial records. Business investments. Property deeds. He had never hidden anything from me because he never saw me as a threat. That was his first mistake. I sifted through the documents, my fingers moving with quiet precision. There were loopholes. Gaps. Vulnerabilities. Jonathan had spent years building an empire, securing every detail. Except for the one thing he had underestimated. Me. His accounts were tied to mine. His signatures existed on shared documents. And most importantly, his trust had left doors wide open. I clicked on a blank document, my mind already forming the next steps. By the time I was done, he would have nothing left. Not his money. Not his security. Not even his name. Because Jonathan thought betrayal had no price. But he was wrong. And I was going to make sure he paid in full. Jonathan thought he had won. He believed I would fade away, broken and forgotten, while he played the devoted partner to Sophia, parading his new life in front of anyone who would watch. He thought I would suffer in silence. That was his second mistake. The first was assuming I had ever needed him in the first place. I sat at my desk, the glow of my laptop illuminating the cold, calculated work I was about to do. My hands moved steadily over the keyboard, clicking through documents Jonathan had never bothered to protect. He had always been careless with details, assuming his power, his influence, and most importantly, his money, would keep him untouchable. I was about to prove him wrong. I had access to everything. Every account. Every investment. Every business deal he had signed off on, often too distracted by his ego to notice the fine print. And I knew exactly where to start. I opened a shared financial document. One that listed our joint assets, loans, and properties. My eyes scanned the screen, the weight of years of betrayal sitting heavy on my chest. He had spent years hiding money, securing it in places he thought were safe. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, blind trusts. He had planned an escape long before I ever realized I needed one. But Jonathan had made one fatal miscalculation. He had left the door open just enough for me to slip in unnoticed. With a few keystrokes, I made minor adjustments. A small, untraceable transfer. Then another. And another. Not large enough to alert him. Not yet. Just enough to plant the first seed of doubt in his empire. Forging Jonathan's signature was too easy. Years of paperwork had given me an advantage. I knew the exact slant of his handwriting, the slight dip in his lowercase y, the way he rushed through his last name as if his own identity didn't require patience. With a steady hand, I signed documents he would never remember signing. Loan approvals. Real estate purchases. Credit line extensions. He had spent years using money to control people. Now money was about to control him. By the time I was done, Jonathan's name was attached to debts he had never taken, liabilities he had never agreed to, and investments that would bleed him dry before he could even blink. The best part? Everything looked perfectly legitimate. Every transfer, every account shift, every signature. It all led back to him. His empire was still standing. For now. But I had just planted the first cracks in its foundation. It wasn't enough to watch him fall. I wanted him to feel it. To see the walls closing in before they finally collapsed. Jonathan's business thrived on trust. Investors believed in him because he projected confidence, stability, and power. All I had to do was introduce the smallest whisper of doubt. I sent an anonymous message to one of his largest investors. Just a few lines. No accusations, no demands. Just enough to make them curious. Have you noticed inconsistencies in Jonathan's financial reports? You should check his recent investments. Some of his holdings don't add up. A simple message. But it was enough. Wealthy men never trust blindly. The moment suspicion is planted, they start digging. And Jonathan? He had no idea that the people who once supported him were now watching his every move. Sophia had never been a threat. She was simply a pawn Jonathan had moved into place, believing I would break at the sight of her. But she was also his greatest weakness. She didn't love him. Not truly. She loved what he provided, the trips, the luxury, the security. And security is a fragile thing. So, I made sure she noticed how much Jonathan's financial stability depended on keeping certain people happy. She started asking questions. Why was Jonathan taking longer business calls? Why did he look tense every time his phone rang? Why had he suddenly stopped promising her the future they had planned? She didn't realize it yet, but she was chipping away at his confidence with every doubt she voiced. And Jonathan? He was too busy holding on to his crumbling empire to see who had set the fire. It took 3 weeks before Jonathan noticed something was wrong. He called me. Not to apologize. Not to acknowledge what he had done. He called because he needed control. And for the first time he didn't have it. Christina. His voice was clipped, professional, like we were business partners, not ex-lovers. I need to meet. Now. I let the silence stretch. Let him sit in it. Then calmly I said, I don't think that's a good idea. You don't think? He exhaled sharply. This isn't about emotions, Christina. There's something happening with my accounts. I need to check. Then you should talk to your accountant. My voice was smooth, detached. You think I haven't? His frustration was palpable. Something isn't adding up. I need to. I cut him off. Jonathan. He stopped talking. I let his name linger between us, a reminder of who he used to be to me. A reminder of everything he threw away. Then, in a voice colder than I ever thought I was capable of, I said, I don't owe you anything. I hung up. And for the first time since he shattered my world, I smiled. The cracks in Jonathan's empire were no longer invisible. His investors were watching him. His accounts were bleeding money faster than he could trace. Sophia was growing restless, sensing the storm before it hit. And Jonathan? For the first time in his carefully constructed life, he was facing a problem he couldn't fix. I closed my laptop, exhaling slowly. This was just the beginning. Jonathan had spent years betting on the idea that he would always win. But I wasn't playing his game anymore. I was rewriting the rules. And soon, he would lose everything. Jonathan was unraveling, and I wasn't even close to being finished. His call had been the first crack in his carefully controlled facade, a glimpse into the storm he wasn't prepared for. He wasn't used to problems he couldn't buy his way out of, wasn't familiar with losing. But now his empire was bleeding and he didn't even know where the wound was. He could feel the weight of something shifting beneath his feet, but he was still grasping in the dark, searching for a culprit he would never find in time. I knew he'd try to cover his tracks. I knew he'd fight to hold on to the illusion of power. But what Jonathan hadn't realized yet was that his greatest weakness wasn't the money slipping through his fingers. It wasn't the investors side-eyeing him, the banks flagging his accounts, or even the loans quietly piling up under his name. His greatest weakness was the one thing he had always assumed was his strength, his ability to manipulate people. And the easiest person to manipulate? The woman he had chosen to replace me. Sophia had been nothing more than an afterthought in my mind, a name attached to betrayal, a woman who had stepped into my life without hesitation, wearing my husband's devotion like a prize she had earned. But I had never blamed her, not truly. She hadn't stolen Jonathan from me. He had walked away willingly, convinced he deserved something shinier, something new. And now I was going to show her exactly what that choice had cost her. Sophia wasn't built for struggle. She had fallen for Jonathan because he had promised her a life without limitations, a future paved with luxury and security. She didn't love him, she loved the idea of what he could give her. The moment that security started to falter, so would her loyalty. I had to make sure she felt it. I had already sown the first seeds of doubt, made her question the stability of the life she had built with him. She had noticed the tension in his shoulders, the unanswered calls, the moments where he disappeared into himself, searching for answers he couldn't find. And now I just needed to guide her toward the inevitable conclusion. It started small. A message seemingly innocent. A whisper that wasn't loud enough to cause alarm, just enough to linger in the back of her mind. Has Jonathan told you about his recent financial troubles? You might want to check your shared accounts. I knew she would read it. I knew she wouldn't believe it, not at first. She would dismiss it, laugh it off as nonsense. But the thought would linger. It would take root. And curiosity is a dangerous thing when trust is already wavering. She wouldn't confront him immediately. That wasn't how women like Sophia operated. She would start with subtlety, testing the waters before making any accusations. She would glance over his phone when he wasn't looking, notice the emails that weren't there before, the stress lines on his forehead he couldn't smooth away. And then one night when he left his laptop open a little too long, when he stepped away for a moment too many, she would look. I knew what she would find. The discrepancies. The flagged transactions. The inconsistencies that didn't align with the life he had promised her. Jonathan would lie, of course. He would assure her it was nothing, a temporary setback, a misunderstanding that would be cleared up soon. He would flash that same confident smile, the one that had convinced me of so many things before. But there was one fundamental difference between me and Sophia. I had loved Jonathan enough to believe him. Sophia had only ever loved what he could give her. And once she started questioning him, once she realized the cracks were deeper than she had expected, that security was no longer guaranteed, her faith in him would shatter. I didn't need to force her hand. I just needed to let her paranoia grow. Another message. This time a little sharper. Did you know Jonathan has a history of moving money without telling his partners? You should check the offshore accounts. The thing about people who build their relationships on deception is that they never fully trust the other person. There's always a part of them that wonders, will they do to me what they did to someone else? Sophia didn't love Jonathan. She loved stability. And the moment she realized that stability was slipping, she would start looking for an escape route. Jonathan had no idea that while he was drowning, the only person he had left was already searching for the lifeboat. It took a week before she made her first move. A quiet, calculated withdrawal from their shared account. Not enough to set off alarms, but enough to give her a cushion, an emergency exit in case things spiraled faster than she expected. Jonathan didn't notice. He was too busy chasing shadows, trying to patch holes in a sinking ship, convinced that if he just found the source of the problem he could stop the bleeding. He didn't realize that Sophia had already smelled the smoke and was preparing to run before the fire consumed everything. Another week passed and I pushed a little further. You might want to check the property titles. They may not be as secure as you think. The moment Sophia saw what I had done, the forged documents, the names shifting on the deeds, the evidence that Jonathan's empire was no longer truly his, she didn't panic. She planned. She started moving assets in her name, securing what she could before it was too late. She withdrew more money, made subtle inquiries into properties under her own control, started laying the foundation for a life without him. And Jonathan? He was still fighting an invisible war, too distracted by his collapsing financial world to realize the one person he had left was preparing to leave him in the wreckage. The night it all came crashing down, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Sophia confronted him in their penthouse, the one I had once called home. I wasn't there to witness it, but I didn't need to be. I could picture it clearly. Her voice sharp with accusation, Jonathan scrambling for explanations, realizing too late that he was grasping at air. She told him she was leaving. That she wasn't going to stay with a man who had nothing to offer her anymore. That he had promised her a future and she wasn't about to let him drag her down with him. Jonathan, for the first time, truly understood what it meant to be abandoned. The irony wasn't lost on me. I watched from a distance as Sophia packed her things, slipping away in the night like a thief, taking whatever remnants of security she could carry. She didn't look back. Jonathan stood at the window of his now empty home, staring out at the city he had once ruled. And for the first time he was alone. Completely. Utterly. Alone. I closed my laptop, exhaling slowly. The pieces were falling into place. Jonathan had spent years believing that money made him invincible, that wealth gave him power. Now he had neither. And I wasn't done yet. Jonathan stood at the window of his penthouse, the city stretching out beneath him, its lights flickering like distant stars. But they weren't his stars anymore. The empire he had built was crumbling, the foundation rotting beneath his feet, and for the first time, there was no one left to prop him up. No Sophia. No business partners. No safety net. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. His phone lay on the marble countertop, the screen lit with unanswered messages. Investors demanding explanations, banks tightening their grip, financial advisors scrambling to put out fires he hadn't even known existed until it was too late. Nothing made sense. How had this happened? Jonathan had always been ahead of the game, always in control. He had money, power, influence. He had protected himself. And yet here he was watching it all slip through his fingers like sand. He picked up the phone, dialing his financial advisor. The call rang once, twice, then straight to voicemail. Panic flickered beneath his skin. This wasn't a setback. This was something else. Something deeper. Something deliberate. He paced the room, his thoughts tangled in knots. The numbers weren't adding up. The withdrawals, the missing assets, the sudden instability in his accounts. It wasn't natural. It wasn't coincidence. Someone had done this to him. And he needed to find out who. Christina sat in her apartment, sipping tea, her laptop open before her. The numbers on the screen were shifting, accounts emptying, assets being flagged. Jonathan was watching his wealth dissolve, and the best part? He didn't even know where to start fixing it. She leaned back in her chair, satisfied. But this wasn't enough. Not yet. Jonathan had spent years weaponizing money, using it as a leash to control everything and everyone in his life. Now she would use that very same leash to tighten around his throat until he had nothing left to bargain with. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. With a slow smile, she pressed call. A voice answered almost immediately. "I was wondering when you'd call." Christina smirked. "Did you get what I sent?" A chuckle. "I did. And I have to say it's impressive. I knew he was careless, but I didn't think it was this bad. People like Jonathan never think they'll fall," she said, tracing the rim of her cup with her finger. "They assume the rules don't apply to them." "They do now," the voice replied. "Once the banks flag him for fraud, there won't be anything left to save." He let that sink in. Fraud. The very word that sent shivers down the spine of men like Jonathan. Because no matter how rich you were, no matter how powerful, once that word was attached to your name, you were finished. Christina had made sure Jonathan's financial history wasn't just messy. It was incriminating. Multiple loans, suspicious transfers, missing funds. It had taken time to plant the evidence to make sure it all led back to him, but now it was complete. The banks wouldn't ask questions. They would react. "Good," she said finally. "Let it begin." Jonathan was woken up by the sound of his phone vibrating against the bedside table. He groggily reached for it, blinking against the harsh glow of the screen. His heart skipped when he saw the name flashing. His bank. He sat up instantly, swiping to answer. "Yeah. Mr. Carter, I'm calling regarding urgent discrepancies in your accounts. There have been multiple flagged transactions." "What transactions?" he snapped, already swinging his legs over the bed, his pulse thudding. "We need you to come into the branch immediately. There are concerns regarding unauthorized movement of funds, including potential fraud." Jonathan's blood ran cold. Fraud. He was out the door in minutes, barely taking the time to throw on a blazer. His driver was waiting outside, but for the first time, Jonathan didn't feel like the man in control. He felt like prey. The drive to the bank felt longer than usual. The city outside blurred past, but his mind was focused on only one thing. Who was doing this? Inside, the atmosphere was tense. He was led to a private office, where a stern-faced executive was waiting. "Mr. Carter, I'll be direct," the man said, sliding a thick file across the desk. "We've found irregularities in your recent financial activity. Large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts. Loans taken under your name without proper documentation." "That's impossible," Jonathan interrupted, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Is it?" The banker arched a brow, flipping the file open. "These are all processed under your authorization. Your signature is here. The accounts are linked to your businesses. It's all legally tied to you." Jonathan's pulse pounded. He leaned forward, staring at the documents, at the evidence stacking against him. The signatures. His. The accounts. His. But he hadn't done this. Had he? He ran a hand through his hair. The stress, the endless transactions, the constant movement of funds. Could he have signed something without realizing it? He swallowed hard. "I need time to look into this." "I'm afraid that's not possible," the banker said. "We're freezing all your accounts effective immediately until this is resolved." Jonathan barely heard the words. His vision blurred. Frozen. His money was frozen. His lifeline, cut off. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I have lawyers. I'll fix this. The banker didn't blink. I suggest you do so quickly. Jonathan stormed out of the office, his breath coming fast. His hands clenched into fists. Someone had set him up. Someone had planned this. He yanked his phone from his pocket, dialing the one person he had always relied on in times of crisis. His most trusted business associate. The call rang. 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 No answer. His chest tightened. Another call. Another silence. One by one, every single person he thought he could depend on was disappearing. And then, one name remained. One person who had yet to reach out, yet to react to his downfall. Christina. His fingers hovered over her contact. His pride screamed at him to not call, to find another way. But he had none. She was the last piece of familiarity in his collapsing world. Finally he pressed call. The line rang once. Twice. Then she answered. Silence stretched between them. Then her voice, smooth, controlled. Jonathan. His throat was tight, his words stiff. I need to see you. A beat. Then soft laughter. Not mocking. Just knowing. I don't think that's a good idea, she said. His jaw clenched. You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly. Her voice was light, almost amused. I told you once that I didn't owe you anything. Did you really think that changed? He exhaled sharply. Christina, please. Silence. Then, you should have thought about that before you made me bury our child alone. The call ended. Jonathan stood frozen, the dial tone ringing in his ears. And for the first time he understood. He wasn't losing everything. He had already lost it. Jonathan stared at his phone, the call having ended, but the weight of Christina's words still hung in the air. You should have thought about that before you made me bury our child alone. His fingers tightened around the device, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had spent his life dismissing people as soon as they were no longer useful, walking away without a second thought. But this was different. This was calculated. Christina hadn't just left him. She had dismantled his world, piece by piece, while he had been too blind to see it happening. Jonathan turned back toward the towering glass windows of his penthouse, but the view no longer looked the same. The city that once felt like his kingdom now felt cold, distant. For the first time in his life he wasn't just facing a setback. He was alone. The next morning he sat in his office, tapping his fingers against the desk, his thoughts tangled in knots. There had to be a way to fix this. His first call was to his lawyer. Voicemail. The second to his financial advisor. Voicemail. By the third call, frustration clawed at his chest. He reached for his assistant's number, knowing that if anyone could track down the people avoiding him, it would be her. But this time the phone didn't ring. A disconnected number. A sickening realization settled in his gut. They weren't just ignoring him. They were gone. One by one, every person he had relied on, every employee, every trusted business associate, every so-called friend, had begun severing ties, leaving him in the wreckage of the life he had built. Jonathan clenched his jaw. This wasn't coincidence. Christina had made sure he wasn't just losing money. He was losing everything. The headlines came first. At first they were whispers, rumors of financial instability, speculation about failed investments. But within days they turned into something worse. Jonathan Carter under investigation for fraud. Once a financial powerhouse, Carter Industries faces internal collapse. Investors pull out, Carter's future in business uncertain. Jonathan slammed his fist onto the desk, rage surging through him. He scrolled through news sites, each article slicing deeper, each accusation more damning than the last. Christina hadn't just destroyed his finances. She had destroyed his reputation. And no one wanted to be associated with a sinking ship. He reached for his phone again, dialing an old contact, someone who had stood by him through worse. The line connected. For a second, relief flickered through him. Then a voice, distant and hesitant. Jonathan. Pause. And he already knew what was coming next. I can't be involved in this. Jonathan swallowed hard. You know I didn't. It doesn't matter. The damage is done. Jonathan gritted his teeth, his grip tightening. So that's it? You're just walking away? Another pause. You made too many enemies, Jonathan. I'm not going down with you. The line went dead. Jonathan exhaled sharply, lowering the phone. His most trusted allies were cutting ties. His entire support system was vanishing before his eyes. That evening he went to the one place he had always considered his safe zone, his private club. The exclusive retreat where billionaires, politicians and power players gathered behind closed doors. The place where deals were made over whiskey and problems were solved before they could make it to the public eye. But as soon as he stepped inside he felt the shift. The glances. The hushed conversations. The way people turned away when they saw him. He walked toward the bar, forcing himself to ignore the growing sense of unease. He ordered a drink, but when the bartender placed the glass in front of him, there was something different in the man's expression. Pity. Disgust. Jonathan's hands curled into fists. His name had always carried weight. It had opened doors, commanded respect. Now it was a liability. People were distancing themselves. Not because they feared him but because they no longer saw him as one of them. Jonathan downed the drink in one go, slamming the glass onto the counter. He turned, surveying the room, looking for someone, anyone, who would still stand by him. Then he saw Nathan Caldwell. An old associate, someone who had once spoken about loyalty as if it was a religion. Jonathan crossed the room in quick strides. Nathan. The man turned, his expression unreadable. Jonathan. Jonathan forced a smirk. Guess the media's having fun, huh? Nathan didn't smile. You shouldn't be here. Jonathan's smirk faltered. Since when do I need permission? Nathan exhaled, setting his drink down. It's not about permission. It's about perception. He met Jonathan's gaze. No one here wants to be seen with you. Not anymore. The words struck deeper than Jonathan expected. His voice was cold when he finally spoke. You're making a mistake. Nathan shook his head. No. You did. He turned and walked away. Jonathan stood there, surrounded by familiar faces that suddenly felt like strangers. And for the first time in his life he knew what it felt like to be powerless. He drove aimlessly through the city, past towering skyscrapers that once felt like his kingdom. Past restaurants where he had celebrated his victories. Past hotels where he had entertained business partners and lovers alike. But tonight none of it felt like his. Tonight the city was just a maze of shadows and he was nothing more than a man who had lost everything. He pulled over on a quiet street, his hands gripping the wheel, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Jonathan Carter had been a man of status, power and control. Now he was just another name on the verge of ruin. His empire, gone. His money, frozen. His allies, abandoned him. And the one person he had never thought capable of standing against him was the one who had orchestrated his downfall. He reached for his phone, hesitating. There was only one name left. Christina. His thumb hovered over the screen. He could call her. Demand an explanation. Beg for help. Try to undo whatever she had done. But as his finger trembled over her name, he already knew the truth. There was no going back. This was what betrayal felt like. This was what losing everything looked like. And Christina had made sure that he had no one left to blame but himself. Jonathan sat in his car, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The city lights outside blurred together, streaks of gold and red melting into the darkness. His mind was spinning, replaying every conversation, every loss, every betrayal. His empire had crumbled beneath him, his wealth slipping through his fingers like water. His allies had abandoned him, his reputation dragged through the mud. And now for the first time in his life he had no power, no control, no safety net. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating. He inhaled sharply, exhaling through gritted teeth. He couldn't afford to sit here wallowing in his downfall. There had to be a way to fix this. There had to be something he could do. For years he had been the man people feared, respected, admired. He had built himself into an untouchable figure. He had risen higher than anyone else, climbed further than anyone thought possible. And now he was a spectacle. A joke. His phone vibrated beside him, snapping him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, his pulse quickening. Another news alert. Another dagger to the chest. Jonathan Carter caught in financial scandal. Is this the end of his legacy? His stomach twisted. He opened the article, his eyes scanning the words, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The accusations were worse than he expected. Fraud. Embezzlement. Mismanagement. The words painted him as a man who had built his success on deception, who had manipulated the system for his own gain. None of it was true. But it didn't matter. People believed what they wanted to believe, and right now they wanted to see him fall. A slow, sickening realization settled in his chest. This wasn't just about his financial ruin. Christina had made sure he didn't just lose money. She had ensured that he lost his name. And once a name was tainted, it was impossible to clean. The world was watching him drown, and no one was coming to save him. The first sign that he was losing more than just business came the next morning. Jonathan arrived at his office, his head held high despite the chaos swirling around him. He walked through the front doors, his steps measured, controlled. He needed to show strength. He needed to remind people who he was. But the moment he stepped inside, he felt it. The shift. The eyes. Employees who once scrambled to please him now avoided his gaze. Conversations hushed as he passed, whispers replacing the usual air of submission. He saw the way they looked at him, not with admiration but with pity. Or worse, disgust. He clenched his jaw, pushing forward, ignoring the sinking feeling in his gut. He stepped into the elevator, the doors closing behind him, sealing him in silence. Then a voice behind him. "I heard the board is considering forcing him out." Jonathan's breath caught. His fingers twitched at his sides. They'd be stupid not to. He's a liability now. The words struck deeper than he expected. He turned slightly, catching the reflection of two employees standing in the corner, speaking in hushed voices. They didn't realize he was there. Or worse, they didn't care. The doors slid open and Jonathan walked out, his shoulders tense, his thoughts spiraling. He needed to get ahead of this. He needed to control the narrative. That afternoon he called for a press conference. It was a desperate move, but he had no choice. He needed to face the media head-on, to re-establish his authority before the damage became irreversible. The room was packed. Reporters, journalists, business analysts, all waiting, hungry for the spectacle. Cameras flashed as he stepped onto the stage, his expression carefully composed. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat and began. "There have been recent allegations regarding my financial affairs," he started, his voice steady. "I want to make one thing clear. I have done nothing illegal. These rumors, these accusations, are an attempt to destroy my career, my reputation. And I will not stand for it." The murmurs began immediately. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion, every bead of sweat on his brow. He knew how to handle the press. He had done it 1,000 times before. But this time he wasn't the one in control. A reporter in the front row stood, a smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. "Mr. Carter, if you have nothing to hide, can you explain these?" She lifted a folder, flipping it open for the cameras to see. The documents inside were crisp, printed in black and white. And Jonathan's stomach dropped. Bank statements, contracts, emails, leaked evidence tying him to fraudulent transactions. The very proof he needed to prove his innocence, except it had been twisted against him. He swallowed hard, gripping the edges of the podium. These are fabrications," he said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. The room erupted in murmurs, the press already forming their headlines. "Are you saying these documents are fake, Mr. Carter?" He opened his mouth. Closed it. The walls were closing in. The flashing cameras, the whispers, the pointed looks. This wasn't a press conference. This was an execution. And Christina had set the stage perfectly. Jonathan barely remembered leaving the room. One moment he was standing at the podium, drowning under the weight of accusations, and the next he was outside, his driver waiting in silence, his car door open. He slid into the back seat, slamming the door shut, his breath uneven. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, scrolling through the countless messages flooding in. Business partners pulling out. Former allies distancing themselves. His company stock plummeting in real time. And then a message from an unknown number. It was just a single line. "You wanted to build a legacy. Now you'll be remembered as a fraud." He knew exactly who it was from. His chest tightened, rage and despair colliding inside him. Christina hadn't just taken his money, his connections, his business. She had taken his identity. The world no longer saw him as a powerful businessman. They saw him as a scandal. A disgrace. A man who had it all and lost everything. And the worst part? They weren't wrong. He had spent his life believing he was untouchable. That no matter what he did, he would always land on his feet. But Christina had proved him wrong. She had ripped away his mask and forced him to face the truth. Jonathan Carter was nothing without his wealth. And now he had nothing left. Jonathan sat in the backseat of his car, the weight of his downfall pressing against his chest like an unbearable force. The city outside blurred past him, the same streets he once dominated now feeling foreign, hostile. The headlines had sealed his fate, the scandal permanently etched into the public eye. Jonathan Carter, the fraudster who lost it all. His name, once synonymous with power, now carried the stench of disgrace. The driver didn't speak as they pulled up to his penthouse. Jonathan stepped out, his movements stiff, his body running on pure survival instinct. He needed a plan, a way to claw his way back. There had to be something left, something salvageable. But when he reached the entrance, he noticed something off. The doorman, a man who had once greeted him with nothing but respect, now hesitated. "Mr. Carter," there was pity in his voice. Hesitation. Jonathan frowned. "What?" The man exhaled, shifting uncomfortably before gesturing toward the doors. "I think you should go upstairs, sir." "Now." Jonathan pushed past him, the tension in his chest tightening as he entered the lobby. People stared, their whispers slicing through the silence. Then he saw them. Two men in black suits stood near the elevator, their presence unmistakable. Bank representatives. Jonathan's stomach churned. His hands balled into fists as he approached. "What the hell is this?" One of the men, older and expressionless, stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, I'm afraid we have orders to seize your assets due to outstanding debts and legal actions. Your properties, including this residence, have been repossessed." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Jonathan's jaw clenched. "That's not possible." "The paperwork is in order," the man continued. "Your accounts have been frozen. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises." A cold sweat formed on his skin. His mind raced, searching for a way out, for leverage. But there was none. Everything was gone. His home. His assets. His wealth. And there was nothing he could do about it. An hour later he stood in his penthouse, staring at the walls that had once symbolized his success. The grand windows overlooked the skyline, but it no longer felt like his city. His things were being packed by silent movers, stripping the space of its identity. His identity. The realization settled over him like a lead weight. He had nowhere to go. No house. No office. No safety net. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, hoping for a miracle. Instead, it was another message from an unknown number. "Losing everything hurts, doesn't it?" Jonathan's fingers tightened around the device. He didn't need to guess who it was from. Christina. His breath was ragged as he stared at the words. She had orchestrated every part of this. She had built this trap, waited patiently, and now she was watching it all play out exactly as she had planned. He swallowed the lump in his throat. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a response. He tossed the phone onto the couch and turned toward his closet, grabbing a single suitcase. There was no point in packing much. Most of what he owned wasn't his anymore. With one last look around, he walked out. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Carter was homeless. 2 weeks later, he found himself in a cheap, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The space was suffocatingly small, the walls stained, the air stale. The kind of place he would have sneered at in another lifetime. The kind of place he never thought he would end up. He sat on the worn-out couch, staring at his laptop, scrolling through job listings. His name was poison. No company would touch him, no investors would meet with him. His once expansive network had collapsed, leaving him with nothing but rejection emails and dead ends. A knock at the door made him flinch. He hesitated before getting up, every step feeling heavier than the last. When he opened it, a man stood on the other side, wearing a company uniform. "Carter." Jonathan stiffened. "Who's asking?" The man handed him an envelope. "Final notice. Your car's getting repossessed. It should have been done last week, but I guess they gave you some extra time." Jonathan stared at the papers in his hands. His last piece of luxury, his final tie to the world he once ruled, gone. The man sighed. "Tough break, man. I'd get your stuff out of the car now before they tow it." Jonathan didn't respond. He simply nodded and shut the door. He stood there for a long moment, the notice crumpled in his hand. This was his new reality. A reality where he wasn't a man of power. A reality where no one cared about Jonathan Carter anymore. Days passed. Then weeks. His bank accounts remained frozen, his legal battles dragging on without end. He had no choice but to look for work. It was humiliating. Every rejection was another reminder of how far he had fallen. At last he found something, an assistant manager position at a local retail store. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't prestigious. But it was all he had. On his first day he stood behind the counter, the cheap uniforms stiff and unfamiliar. The store was quiet, customers shuffling in and out without paying him a second glance. Then, as if fate wanted to twist the knife deeper, he saw someone familiar. Nathan Caldwell. An old associate, a man who used to shake his hand at million-dollar deals. Nathan walked in, brows furrowed as he glanced at the shelves, clearly looking for something. Then he saw Jonathan. His expression shifted. Recognition. Surprise. Then something worse. Pity. Jonathan. Nathan said, his voice laced with disbelief. Jonathan forced himself to stand straighter. Nathan. Nathan hesitated. He glanced around the store, then back at Jonathan. I heard things had gotten bad. But I didn't realize. Jonathan clenched his jaw. Need help finding something? Nathan's lips parted slightly as if searching for the right thing to say. But in the end he simply nodded. Yeah. Just looking for a phone charger. Jonathan turned, walking to the electronics section, his movements stiff, mechanical. He grabbed a charger from the shelf and handed it to Nathan. Nathan hesitated before taking it. I hope you're doing okay, he said. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Yeah. I'm great. Nathan gave him one last glance before heading to the register. Jonathan stood there for a long time, staring at the empty aisle. He had spent his life believing that money was everything. That status defined a person. Now, standing in a job he never thought he'd need, in a life he never imagined for himself, he finally understood what it meant to have nothing. Christina had taken it all. And for the first time he knew he deserved it. Jonathan stood in the dimly lit stockroom, staring at the cold metal shelves stacked with inventory. The scent of cardboard and stale air filled his lungs. A month ago he had been sitting in a glass office, signing multi-million-dollar deals, commanding rooms filled with powerful men who hung on to his every word. Now he was scanning barcodes and stocking shelves in a store where no one even knew his name. The finality of his downfall had settled into his bones. There was no escaping it now. No fixing it. No climbing back to the top. He had lost everything, his fortune, his power, his allies. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that no matter what mistakes he made he would always land on his feet. But Christina had made sure he never would again. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. His shift was almost over. Another night of returning to a dingy apartment, eating cheap takeout and scrolling through job listings that would never lead anywhere. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, already expecting another "we're sorry, but we have chosen another candidate" email. Instead it was a message from an unknown number. Are you ready to face me now? His breath caught. His fingers tightened around the phone. He didn't need to guess who it was. For weeks, Christina had been silent. She had watched from the shadows, letting his world burn without interference. But now she was making herself known. He swallowed hard, his thumb hovering over the screen. Every instinct told him to ignore it, to walk away. But deep down he knew he couldn't. This wasn't over. And it never would be until he saw her one last time. The coffee shop was quiet, nearly empty. Jonathan walked in, his steps hesitant, his clothes nowhere near the tailored suits he used to wear. His reflection in the window was unrecognizable, his once groomed appearance now replaced with exhaustion, his face sharper, the weight of his downfall etched into every feature. Then he saw her. Christina sat near the back, her posture relaxed, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup. She looked different. Not colder, not crueler. Just free. She met his gaze without hesitation. No anger, no triumph. Just calm. Jonathan approached slowly, every step heavier than the last. He slid into the seat across from her, the silence stretching between them. For a long moment neither spoke. Then finally he exhaled. You did all of this, he said, his voice hoarse. Christina tilted her head slightly. Did I? His jaw clenched. Don't play games with me. The accounts. The fraud accusations. The investors pulling out. The media leaks. That was you. She didn't confirm. She didn't deny it either. Jonathan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Why? Her eyes flickered, but she didn't answer right away. She simply took a slow sip of her coffee before setting the cup down carefully. Then, in a voice so steady it sent a chill through him, she said, "Because you made me bury our child alone." Jonathan's breath hitched. He had expected a dozen reasons. Revenge. Spite. The thrill of watching him suffer. But this hit deeper than anything he had prepared for. The memory of that night came flooding back. Her tear-streaked face in that hospital room. The stillborn child she had held in her arms. The calls he had ignored. The excuses he had made. The celebration he had been at with Sophia while she had grieved alone. His fingers curled into fists. "Christina, I don't need your apology," she cut in, her voice unreadable. "I don't need your guilt either. What's done is done." He looked away, shame twisting in his gut. "You destroyed me," she exhaled, almost as if she had been waiting for those words. "No, Jonathan. You destroyed yourself. I just gave you the consequences you thought you'd never have to face." Silence stretched between them again, heavier than before. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, his chest tightening. "So what now?" Christina studied him as if deciding whether she should even answer. Then after a moment she leaned forward slightly. "You wanted to be untouchable," she murmured. "To live without consequence. You thought people were disposable, that money would always keep you above everyone else." She leaned back, her expression unreadable. "Well, now you know what it feels like to be nothing." Jonathan swallowed, his throat dry. He should have been angry. Furious. But the truth settled in like a stone. He was right. And he had never been more aware of it than in that moment. He had built his life on a foundation of power, control, and selfishness. And when it was all stripped away, what was left? Nothing. Just a man sitting across from his ex-wife, realizing that she had won long before he had even noticed the game had started. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "Are you here to watch me suffer?" Christina shook her head. "No. I've already watched enough." He searched her face, trying to find something. Hatred, triumph, satisfaction. But he found none of it. Just finality. She had already moved on. And somehow that hurt more than anything else. Jonathan exhaled shakily, nodding. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I don't know what to do now." Christina regarded him for a long moment before answering. "That's not my problem anymore." She grabbed her purse, standing gracefully. Jonathan watched as she slid on her coat, as if this was just another ordinary conversation. But before she turned to leave, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I didn't do this out of hate." Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. "Then why?" Christina's lips curved slightly, not a smile, not quite. "You deserve to lose everything." And with that she walked away. Jonathan didn't move, didn't call after her. He simply sat there, staring at the empty seat across from him, the weight of his own irrelevance crushing down on him. For the first time in his life there was no next move. No plan. No way out. Just silence. And Jonathan Carter, finally understanding the true price of betrayal.